Now that you've had, it's been almost a month, it'll be a month
Yes.
this Friday. What's your best guess as to what happened to her?
In May 1996, you maliciously murdered Kristin Smart.
Kristin, your voice has at last been heard. Know that you are forever in our hearts.
Despite the intense amount of media attention, Kristin was much more than a headline on the news.
No one could want to keep a secret like this. With empathy, Paul Flores would be willing to break 2 decades of silence.
In breaking news regarding the Kristin Smart murder trial, Paul Flores has been found guilty of the 1996 murder of Kristin Smart, and his father, Ruben Flores, has been found not guilty of accessory.
It's different when someone goes missing in your own backyard.
Hello, and thanks for tuning into Mustang News.
Hello and welcome to Mustang News.
Cal Poly freshman Kristin Smart went missing in 1996.
I'm Catherine Allen, the editor-in-chief of Mustang Media Group.
My name is Nico Vignuela, and I covered the Kristin Smart trial from July to October of 2022 in Monterey County.
I'm here today with Chris Lambert, whose podcast revived the case, ultimately helping take it to trial.
I'm joined here today by Harlod Mesick, who represented Ruben Flores in court.
Gosh, I think I've gone through every possible emotion. The day of the verdicts was obviously pretty overwhelming. And then a couple days after was just sort of surreal. And then I spent the time since then like trying to get back to my normal life because I spent so many years covering the case, and then most of last year was devoted to living up north and covering the trial. So I've been trying to catch up on real life again.
How do you feel about the one getting the not guilty verdict?
Well, I had an 80-year-old man who's never been in trouble in his life. And he's actually, a kind, generous man. I didn't just make that up. I've seen the evidence of it. He's in the unfortunate position of being the father of a guy charged with murder.
We are also thankful for the selfless contributions of Chris Lambert, his Your Own Backyard podcast, which brought not only new information, and also the needed light, for the attention during our darkest moments, sharing Kristin's voice and story.
Initially, when I first got the idea, like I want to make a documentary about this, I asked everyone I knew. Like I went to get my hair cut and I was like, do you remember who Kristin Smart was? Nobody did. And it was like, they would recognize the name, but they were like, is that the girl who was kidnapped? And is it like, they remembered little other cases that reminded them of it. They knew the name, but it was like, no, this is the one from Cal Poly. She went to a party, she was walking back, and that's the last place she was seen. And nobody really knew those details. So it was like, wow, it feels like nobody I talked to remembers. And there was always a core group in the community who was trying to keep her name alive. There were people who started websites, there were people who had bumper stickers, but it was such a small number. It needed to be, there needed to be something that got the word out about it beyond that. So I started collecting those and putting them all in one place.
So, Your Own Backyard.
Yes.
I mean, the podcast was a huge part of moving the case to trial. It was a huge point of the defense that it pointed the finger at Paul and Ruben. How do you feel about Chris Lambert? I mean, specifically.
I think Chris, I think most people act, not only in their own best interest, but most people have good motives for doing what they're doing. And I think he had a good motive. Do I think that he might have influenced some people's testimony? Yes. Do I think that he colluded perhaps with Jennifer Hudson and Dustin Goodwin? We know he did because, again, of the false information that was planted by the government to see how far it would go, right?
there is talk about police feeding false information to the podcast and trying to get leads that way.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit more about that from your perspective?
Yeah, so like it all came down in that instance to this this thing about the trucks being recovered. So to back up, in 1996 when this incident occurred, the Flores family owned 2 trucks. There was Paul's Ford Ranger, which was green, and Ruben Flores had a white Nissan truck that was not being driven at the time or something. And so Paul had had his license taken away. His Ranger was at Ruben's house in the garage and all that stuff. And after this occurred and Paul became the suspect, both of those trucks were gone within like 6 months to a year. One of them was reportedly stolen and one was sold. So when I started investigating, it was like, we need to find out what happened to those trucks, because somehow Kristin's body was relocated from campus to wherever her body was buried. And I had developed the theory early on that because Paul's windows, the windows in the red brick dorms open upward on hinges, some of the students I interviewed, like that's how they take their surfboards in and out. These are like 7-foot surfboards. So if you can get those in and out, you can get a body in and out. And that back parking lot is very shady, and it's easy to get to. It's quiet. Nobody else parks there except like maintenance people. And so I just thought one of those trucks was used to relocate Kristin's body, and there's a reason they disappeared the way that they did. But I didn't know what the sheriff's department had and what they didn't. It's like maybe they located these trucks a long time ago and they just haven't announced that publicly. I had said some of that on the podcast, that this is my theory and we need to figure out what happened to those trucks. And I think what happened was privately the sheriff's department was listening to those episodes and having meetings about it, like we have located one of those trucks, and that is information we've been sitting on. And at some point they determined, I think later on through a wiretap, that the Flores family was listening very intently to the podcast.
The other thing I need you to do is to start listening to the podcast. I need you to listen to everything they say so we could punch holes in it. Wherever we can punch holes, maybe we can't. You're the one that can tell me.
They thought it might be interesting while we have this wiretap running to let the Flores family know we have one of those trucks, to see if it sparks any sort of conversation. And so they reached out to me, and they didn't tell me any of what they had planned. They certainly didn't tell me there was a wiretap in place. There was no information shared. What was given to me was, we would like to sit down for an interview with you and share some information that has never been shared before. And we would like you to put it out in this timeline. We need it out at this certain time. And so it was like, great. So I sat down with them and they revealed to me that they had located one of the trucks. And so what happened was the sheriff's department shared real information with me, which is, we've recovered a truck and we would like to give you that info to put out. But you can't say the sheriff's department told me there's a truck. So we're just gonna have you say that information in your own way and just say, I got it from an anonymous source. And so that was how it was approached, and somehow that got misinterpreted through the trial as being false information that was planted somehow. And when it was not elaborated on, it sounds really shady. It's like they were giving false information to the podcaster. And I think at some point they clarified that it wasn't false information, it was information given to provoke a response on the wiretap. And so there was nothing that was made up. There was nothing that was not real information. It was just about how it was presented.
Did his podcast influence the testimony of any of these witnesses? I think it did. I know it did in several of the early witnesses, the ones who were at the party, the ones who knew Kristin, because I've read their questionnaires from '96 when she first went missing. And I'll tell you this, their testimony did not comport to what they said in '96, almost to a person.
What makes you think that it was the podcast that made that change?
Well, because he came up with details that a lot of people were unaware of. and suddenly their testimony seems to match. So it starts to corroborate each other, right? Let's use Tim Davis as an example. Tim Davis, early on, answered a questionnaire. He was at the party, and he heard a thump around the corner. And he went around the corner of the wall, and he saw Kristin on the floor. He didn't see Paul near her or on top of her. But by the time we get to the prelim, and the fall became a big deal because of the podcast, Tim Davis was testifying that he saw Kristin fall with Paul on top of her. Now that's entirely different than what he said in the answer to the questionnaire, or when he was first interviewed by the police, I forget, but I have a police report. I don't just make this stuff up.
4 or 5 people told us that they saw you trying to kiss her at the party. And in fact, it was in the hallway at the party, and you were trying to kiss her. In fact, I think she fell down on the ground, and you were kind of laying down next to her, trying to kiss her or something. Can you remember what happened with that?
I don't remember doing anything like that.
Okay. But I mean, this isn't where just one person told us, several people saw this.
Okay, let me just ask you,
Okay.
one of the people at the party, there was no doubt in their mind, said that you and Roxy fell to the floor.
I never fell to the floor.
Well, why are these people lying to us, Paul?
Mistaken, I guess,
They're
because
mistaken?
Robert Sanger brought that up a little bit in the trial, kind of saying that it's a constant theme that people can't remember. Was that frustrating for you at all, hearing that just during the testimony?
Not really. For one, I feel like there's a huge difference between things you remember that happened to you and things that you remember or can't remember when you're being asked 26 years later. Like, what color shirt were you wearing at the party? Where did you park? And it's like, I don't remember any of that stuff. What I do remember is there was a girl there, and she was dressed this way, and she was really drunk or intoxicated in some way. There was a guy who was hanging around her. Like, they remember those details because within 2 or 3 days of that, she's reported missing, and people are going, I saw her. And so that sticks in their head, especially once there's missing person posters up, that becomes a memorable event. But then 26 years later, you get cross-examined and asked, he asked one witness, did you ever go eat lunch in the village? Did you ever eat at any of the restaurants in the village? And this witness was like, I have no idea. That's such a strange question, and for me to try to remember that. I didn't run into a lot of problems with people's memories regarding the incident itself or that time period. It was mostly when I would try to fill in gaps from one person's memory, and I would go around and say, this person can't remember this detail. Do you happen to remember that? And they would say, no, but you know who would is this person. So I got passed around a lot to people who sort of corroborated information that I would get. They didn't know either. Like, I got this info from one person, and then this person over here told me this, and I was able to piece it all together.
During cross-examination, Sanger would kind of mention some negative things about you specifically. What was that like, sitting there in the room? What was kind of going through your mind during that?
Well, it started at the preliminary hearing, which was a year before the trial, and so that was the first taste I got of it, like sitting in a room with a notebook taking notes, and all of a sudden they're talking about you, and I would just kind of freeze up for a bit, like, okay, here we go. And then I was curious about how much of a role the podcast was going to play in the defense's argument. Is it going to be that they say all of this information was made up by the podcaster, or are they going to say the podcaster had ulterior motives, like he was just after the reward money, or he was trying to get famous, make a name for himself or something? So I was curious how it was going to play out, and they did a little bit of each of those things. I felt like at a certain point, it's like they have to defend their client, and there's certainly an argument to be made in a case like this that it's like, maybe this podcaster is the problem, or maybe this is the reason why all this happened. But I felt like I was pretty relieved that all of the witnesses who were questioned were very straightforward and were like, this is just a guy who interviewed me. I'm just exactly what you're doing now. He just asked me questions about what I remembered. He didn't feed information to me. He didn't try to get me to change my story or influence me in any way. He just said, can I interview you? He interviewed me, and that's the end of it. By sheer coincidence, One of my acquaintances happened to go to high school with Paul Flores, and I ask her if she's willing to share anything she remembers about him. In a message online, she tells me, "We always called him Scary Paul." What I found out really early on in investigating is there were a lot more people who remembered Paul Flores. It was people who had gone to school with Paul Flores prior to Kristin disappearing, who had seen his name connected to this and thought, he did it. Like, I know that guy. I went to school with that guy. I went to parties with that guy. If that girl was last seen with him and she never resurfaced, he did it. There was just no question.
Paul wasn't liked. Paul was picked on. Paul was bullied. Paul stutters. Paul had very minimal, if any, sexual experience at the time.
You're kind of describing Paul as a kind freshman who got bullied. How do you assume that the jury can think of him as something like that when the prosecution brings in two women who say that Paul Flores raped them 2008, 2011, and establish a pattern of Paul, and even Pavel called him a serial rapist? How do you assume that the jury can think of Paul that way even as a 19-year-old?
Well, these two women, he was much older, right, when these two women alleged that they were raped. Neither one of them went to the police, right? Neither one of them complained.
Well, that's not necessarily true. They did. They went to at least one of them.
Well, she said she went and was turned away because they wouldn't take a complaint.
That's right, but she went. I mean, if anything,
she said
that
she
speaks
went.
more to the failing of the system on her end, but...
The other witness said she knew nothing of the case, and yet she lived in AG at the time Kristin went missing and actually went to Cal Poly. Remember that? So again, inconsistent statements ought to be used both ways. They convicted him with the post-conduct evidence. They didn't convict him with his evidence leading up to Kristin's disappearance. They convicted him on an emotional basis, and this is what juries do.
What did you think of Ruben Flores' not guilty verdict?
It was something that I sort of saw coming. It was like, there's going to be a higher threshold for this. Even though the sentence is, severely smaller and the jury wasn't allowed to know that information, I think had they known that he was going to get so little time, they might have come to a different verdict. When they read the verdict, I noticed that two of those jurors were crying. And I don't think it was easy for them because I think at least some of them, I think they saw the pieces. They could see what happened, but they just felt like the threshold for finding someone guilty of that crime was too high to risk on like I'm 90% sure that this is what happened, but I don't know. After this, they're going to go home and they're going to Google it. They're going to listen to the podcast and they're going to hear deposition tapes, which didn't enter at trial, like things that I had access to that were like, yeah, there's a lot more to this than what you heard at trial, and they're going to be frustrated.
For Paul Flores' jury, did they seem really certain about it?
Yeah, they seemed really certain when they went through the verdict. Obviously, there were a few different conclusions they could have come to. There was first-degree murder, there was felony murder, and when they read the verdict and went with first degree, that was a little surprising to me. It was like, wow, not only were they certain, but like no reasonable doubt, but they went with the highest degree possible. And I just sort of looked at them and kind of scanned their faces really quick, and they just seemed so resolute and so confident, like that's the conclusion we all reached.
One thing that really does look bad, and I don't know if you want to discuss this now. Last time we talked to you, you had a black eye.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. And what did you tell us?
I told you I got it playing basketball.
That's right. And where did you get it?
In my car.
And how did you get the black eye?
I hit the steering wheel. That's about it. But like, how often do people hit their eye in the steering wheel? So.
I don't know.
See, it was like right here. So then I went like that, popped up, and then.
Okay. Let me ask you this.
But.
Listen. Why didn't you tell us that?
Because it doesn't sound like a very likely thing.
That's exactly my point. Do you see my point now, what I'm getting about on all this other stuff that happened? When you tell us something like that, and it doesn't make sense, see how bad it looks? Why was it so hard for you to tell us that you got that black eye hitting the steering wheel?
It didn't really matter.
What do you mean it didn't matter?
It was days later, so why would it?
Okay, if it didn't matter, then why did you lie about it? Now, how do we know that everything that you've told us so far, you don't really think it matters, so that's why you're telling us some of the things, and maybe what you're telling us isn't really the truth? How do we know now that you've lied to us?
Well, that wasn't important though.
Sure it is. That's important. What if Roxy punched you in the eye?
Yeah.
See? See why it's important? What if Roxy punched you in the eye?
Not a big old black eye.
Well, not a big old one. One about that size. Let me ask you this. Are you telling us the truth how you got that black eye?
Yep.
If you're going to tell us a lie about something that means nothing, about a black eye, then what else haven't you been truthful about?
Paul was consistent in virtually everything he said except the black eye, right? So, but other than that, his story was always the same. Walked her home, got her within sight of her dorm, said goodnight. He went in, he threw up, woke up the next day, still hungover, calls his dad the following Sunday morning, says, Dad, you know, I'm feeling better. How about if I come home for dinner and work on the truck, because they were selling his truck.
Were there any points when you thought that maybe Paul Flores wouldn't have been found guilty?
I tried not to have any expectations with that because there's been times in my head where I'm just wondering, has this been explained to an extent that an average person off the street, which is essentially what jurors should be, they're people with no knowledge of the case up front, has it been explained well enough that they can see the outline here? They can see what happened and what led them here. And it just seems like an unpredictable sort of thing. I know there's been major trials where people that we all believe were guilty were found not guilty and vice versa. And so I tried not to have any expectations about what that was going to lead to, but certainly the day of the verdict, I was like, I have no idea what's about to happen. I know how I felt, and I know how I felt when closing arguments happened. Like, I think I know where this is going. And but the day of the verdict reading, it was like, could be a coin toss, honestly.
And when it was announced, how did it feel?
When they announced Paul's verdict, it was hard to process for me. I think I'd spent so much time, and I really didn't sleep well when I was covering the trial. Like, I exhausted myself, and I didn't pace myself very well. So that day I was already just sort of running on fumes, essentially. And so a couple seconds after they announced it, I just started crying in the courtroom and hoping that nobody around me was noticing. And then sort of the process of going down the line and making sure each juror affirms their verdict took a few minutes, and in that time I probably cried 3 separate times and tried to collect myself, and yeah, it was a lot.
The Sheriff's Department has credited the podcast, your work, for even being able to get to this point and get that verdict. Why do you think that they kind of weren't able or getting to that point before you started the podcast?
I think it's kind of a complicated answer. It starts from day one, the way that the investigation unfolded with campus police, how long it took to pass it off to the Sheriff's Department, the early sheriff's administrations, and how they didn't really respond in a timely manner. And when they did, there were just so many balls dropped. It was like efforts that they just didn't take it all the way every time. And then so many years of that, I think after the first year, it felt like things just sort of dropped off. And there were things here and there behind the scenes, but when you lay it out on a timeline, like I have, a very detailed timeline of everything that happened that I know in this case, it was like, wow, there were entire years where nothing was accomplished, and that's very frustrating. And so I feel like where it was at when I started the podcast was like, well, we've tried everything we can, and this case is so old, and we sort of know what happened here, but there's just no way to prosecute. I think that the podcast sort of jump-started that process again. It was like, well, I can talk to people that maybe aren't comfortable talking to police, or I can find pieces that maybe had been forgotten and stuff. And so I think it was a combination of that and them actually having the resolve to follow up with it. Because if I had done what I did and they didn't follow up, it would have been nothing.
Yeah.
And so it took both.
And also as a local, this case kind of has more of a personal aspect to you as well, because you mentioned in the podcast you were 11 when this happened and kind of grew up around this. How do you kind of remember when you realized this was kind of an ongoing situation in your community, kind of a subliminal conversation going on in the community, and what made you want to really start digging into it?
I remember, like, initially when it happened, I was a little kid, and I remember hearing about it on the news, but it was like, I didn't really know how local it was. It was just like another name on the news, and when it would pop up every once in a while, I'd hear about it again. But when I got a little older and started coming up to Arroyo Grande to visit friends, I'd drive past that billboard in the village, and it was like, that girl's still missing? That's so weird that we don't talk about it. Like, I don't know anybody who's out with shovels looking for her. Like, shouldn't we be searching? And so it was in 2016, the Sheriff's Department announced that they were going to dig up on Pauley Hill beneath the big P on the side. And that was like, whoa, that's, I think they figured out where Kristin's buried. Like, I think they must know something, something's going on. And then once that happened, it just got really quiet for a long time. Yeah. And I remember them doing a 1-year update on the news where they said it's been 1 year since they dug, and the Sheriff's Department says they have no information to share. So then another full year passed and there was no update, and that's when I started Googling, like, what's this case all about, and what do they know, and why hasn't it been solved? And that's when I really got in deep. Like, somebody should make a documentary about this. This is like, it's a case with a lot of details that even locals like myself who grew up in the area don't know enough about.
Do you think that Paul Flores is innocent?
Well, the jury found Paul guilty after 3 months of a very, what would you call it, energetic trial. Now, the way our system works, you can discount 99% of what's been testified to in court. You can discount all the evidence, and you can choose to believe one person's testimony. If you find it credible, you can find a person guilty based on the 1% versus the 99. It's not a majority rules kind of thing. It's not a overwhelming evidence. And so they had the one witness who
Hudson?
Yep.
Sure.
So they had her claiming she heard Paul confess. If the jury believed her, that's enough. Do I think the jury found Paul guilty? I respect the jury system. I would have found him not guilty if I had been on that jury.
I want to ask you,
okay,
do you regret anything about the trial?
I regret Paul being convicted. Do I regret anything about my own conduct? I might have gone back and been a little tougher on a couple witnesses, but there was a reason I didn't. I regret maybe not having done a few things, and especially maybe to help Paul a little more.
Like what?
Well, I tried to humanize him in my clothes a little bit. I think there could have been more of that done.
Is there anything else that you want to add that we didn't cover?
I could be wrong. Paul could be guilty. The jury certainly found him guilty, so it's easy to believe he's guilty. I'm going to continue to believe that the jury in this case came to their conclusion that he's a bad guy, and so therefore he probably did it. But probably, like we say in the defense, probably is normally not good enough. It's got to be more certain. And how you can be certain in this case is beyond me. He killed her during the commission or attempt of a rape. That's the charge. How you can conclude that I just can't get there, but I'm a defense attorney, so I have a bias. My perspective is going to be always towards innocence.
I almost feel like an imposter at times when they ask me questions like, so you solved this case, how do you feel? And it's like, well, I didn't solve this case. The solution was there, but nobody was moving it forward. And so a lot of people could have done it, but they just weren't doing it. And I just happened to pick up the pieces at the right time and approach it in the right way and sort of sensitive in the right ways and made sure that everything was appropriately done. And so I don't want to take a lot of credit for it. And I feel like sometimes when I've done like the bigger interviews where like big networks want to sit down with me, their angle is a little bit more like that. Like, so you're a hero. How do you feel? And it's like, I don't really feel like a hero. Like it still bothers me that Kristin's body has not been located. And that is the piece that I felt like was the only thing that was going to make me feel like I had done a good job. Like everything else leading up to that is like, well, that's one piece of it. And I'm glad that this happened. I'm glad that this happened, but where's Kristin's body today? And are her parents ever going to, recover her remains? So is this the end of the investigation? What's next?
Sheriff Parkinson has devoted that this case will continue to be followed up on.
I think the case itself, like as a case, I think is wrapped up. It's pretty much done now. But Kristin and her family, I think, are just going to always be part of my life now. No matter what I do, that will continue.
Any future parole board should know this defendant has proven over and over again he has no problem lying to achieve what he wants.
Mr. Flores, you have been a cancer to society. Kristin Smart was a bright, caring, and loving daughter, sister, and friend.